Getting ready for this year's Selichos, returning to Hashem and saying that we wish to continue this project together, despite the ups and downs. And as a person should, I always try to listen to my wife. My wife said that I should speak about some of the time that we spent in America, specifically 2 years ago when I wasn't able to be here in remote. Every year we've been zocheh to daven Selichos together. And 2 years ago and 3 years ago, those two experiences were because of our great sins. We were exiled from the land. We weren't able to be here. And I was receiving treatment. So one thing that comes to mind all the time about that particular experience, which who knew that it would be so apropos, and that so many years later we'd still be experiencing some modicum of the same heartbreak of not really knowing what's up and what's down with these masks and with all of these different aspects of attempting to live in a world that is so unclear. So immediately after I had a bone marrow transplant from a donor, a few days after, I was in the hospital. My immune system was at zero. I had a white blood cell count of 0. And like this. I had a white blood cell count of 0. And my daughter, Noah, who is now 9, but at the time was several years younger, came to visit me in the hospital. And I was hooked up to an IV machine. I had other machines that were attached to me. And I asked the nurses, my daughter's coming to see me in the hospital.
Ellie, come get your teak from me.
I didn't want her to be afraid. I didn't want her to be scared. So I asked the nurses if they would please detach me if it would be dangerous in any way. And they obviously wouldn't do it. But if it wouldn't be dangerous, if there's a way to detach me from the IV machines, detach any of the scary devices that were making sure and monitoring my health. And if I could take off my hospital gown and just wear regular clothing. And they were okay with it. Okay, the nurses gave the okay. And I tag teamed with my wife that when she would bring up my daughter, she would call, we're on our way up the elevator. And I was able to come out like that. Now, there's one last thing this is before Corona, before the world got used to seeing people in masks. There's one more thing that was kind of tugging at me. It was that my daughter would come up and she would come out of the elevator and I would walk towards her and I would be wearing this funny mask. She was little. It was not the way that I'm looking out here right now where everyone wears a mask, and that was something that even kids are not frightened by. So I decided, without really asking anybody, that I was going to just keep the mask in my hand. And then once I saw her from a distance, I would say, look at this funny mask that the doctors gave Abba to protect himself, But once she was able to see my face and be able to put the mask on, it was like a whole different thing. And I always think back to that experience because it's not just that experience with me and my daughter, but in some peculiar way, I always come back to that feeling that when we come to this night, or we come to other ma'amadim, we come to these other experiences where we're coming to face Hashem, and maybe Hashem himself is not scary, but maybe there are certain things about the way that Hashem runs his world with din v'cheshbon, certain aspects which are maybe putting us in an uncomfortable state. Hashem always, what I want to talk about for the few minutes that we have before Selichos, Hashem always, before we come face to face with Hashem, when he's wearing all those masks, the masks of I'm not good enough, the masks of feeling disappointed in ourselves, we stand in the or of Hashem's light. Before we come to the place of the dinim, before we come to the place of feeling uncomfortable with ourselves, there is this profound feeling that we catch a glimpse of Hashem without the mask. We catch a glimpse of Hashem willing to forgive, smiling, explaining, the only reason I'm wearing this mask is in some way to protect. There's some protection that's going on here, whether it's in the case of a father to a daughter in a hospital setting where it's the father protecting himself, or whether he's wearing the mask because he's also in a certain case sometimes. Hashem gives us a glimpse of that, flashes us a smile before putting the one of the Gemaras that describes this, we don't really have in Chazal any source for Selichos. It's not really on the books so much, it's a Minhag Yisrael. The Gemara talks about this Indian of Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, which sits at the epicenter of the Selichos experience. But the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, this recipe that we have to attach to Hashem's forgiveness, that is mentioned in the Gemara in a certain sense, where the Gemara says that it would be heretical to say such a thing if not for the fact that the Gemara itself seems to indicate this based on some psukim. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kiviyachol, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he was teaching Moshe Rabbeinu the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, Pasuk says, we'll say it so many times over the next little bit, that Vayavor Hashem al panav vayikra, Hashem passed over his face. And in the simple interpretation of the pasuk, the way that we always read it our whole lives, is that Moshe Rabbeinu was in some cleft in the rock. Moshe Rabbeinu was hiding, and Hashem passed over Moshe Rabbeinu's face. But the Gemara explains that it's not only that Hashem passed over Moshe's face, and says the Gemara would be couldn't even utter such words other than the fact that the Torah seems to indicate this, that Kadosh Baruch Hu Ki'ilu himself passed over his own face. The reference to the fact that Hashem donned a white talus, like a white talus. Hashem donned this white talus and passed it over his own face like a chazan does, as he taught Moshe Rabbeinu the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim. We spoke a little bit about Friday night. And the Marsha over there, in that Gemara, explains that exactly as I said a moment ago, in the same way that when I went to see my daughter when I was sick in the hospital, first I wanted her to see my face, and then I covered myself with a mask so as not to frighten her. So the Marsha explains that this white talus that Hashem passed over his face, Marsha writes, I saw in an old book of the Mekubalim, Kach state in the Marsha, I saw in an old book of the Mekubalim that this white talus, Kiviyachol, that Hashem was Kiviyachol wearing, is the same white talus that Hashem was wearing when he created the world. The Gemara says that prior to the creation of the world, one of the 7 things that Hashem created before creating the world was Hashem created this koach of tshuva. Hashem created the possibility that a person can return. There's the possibility of a person making amends. And so that same talus that Hashem wore, Kiviyachol, when he was creating the world, he put on again to show Moshe Rabbeinu that even though I'm about to cover myself in this talus, and even though the entire experience of Din V'Cheshbon, which is about to unfold in front of us before that, I want to flash a smile at you that you recognize that there's a creative element to this. There's creation. Tshuva, in the language of so many different tzaddikim, in the language of Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, in the language of Rav Soloveitchik, in the language of Rav Kook, in the language of so many different people, tshuva is a creative act. Tshuva is a creative act. Hashem wore that white talus when he was creating the world, and he wore that white talus when he was teaching us the koach of tshuva. So there's a Torah that I want to share here very quickly from Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Charlat. This is really the only thing that I wanted to share in order to open up the heart a little bit, sharing a little bit from personal experience. But this Torah from Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Charlat, he quotes the machlokas between the Ramban and the Barbanel. In the beginning of the Torah, Bereshis bara Elokim Eis Hashamayim Ve'eis Haaretz, the Ramban explains that we have 3 different words that describe creation. There's the word bara, and we also find that Hashem, in addition to being bara the world, he also was asa, and he was yatzar. Hashem did a number of different pu'ulos in order to create the world. And the Ramban explains that these different names, these different pu'ulos, describe at least 2 different stages, at least in the big sense, of creation. bara, which we're all familiar with this idea, perhaps, that Hashem created the world. Bara, yesh me'ayin, followed by creating the world, something from something that was already created. First, there was Bereshis bara Elokim. Hashem created the atomized world, this primordial matter. And then after that, he took this matter and he formed it into the trees and the birds and the fish and humans and all the different parts of creation. And so the Ramban says that there were these two stages of creation. There's the first creation of the stuff creation. That's called bara, yesh me'ayin. And then once there's stuff, Hashem took and created yesh me'yesh from that stuff.
Did you turn the alarm off when you
The
came in?
Barbanel says,
So it was.
the Barbanel says, Allah which is so shocking. The Barbanel says, Chas v'shalom, lo kain chelek b'Yakov. We don't have such an idea amongst the Jewish people. This is not a Jewish idea. He cries foul on the Rambam. He says, this is, Hashem is Hakol Yachol. And Hashem, with his Ratzon HaPashut, his simple will, decided to create the world. And despite the fact that the Torah describes a process of 7 days, it was all Koach Echad and a Ratzon HaPashut that Hashem wanted to create the world. Hashem created the primordial matter and then had to look in the IKEA booklet to look to see how to put the pieces together. We don't have such an idea amongst the Jewish people. And Rav Yaakov Moshe comes to the defense of the Ramban, or perhaps comes to make shalom between the Ramban and the Barbanel. And he says that the reason that Hashem created the world in 2 stages is that Hashem wanted to teach the human being that he's also capable of creating. In other words, the first stage, Hashem created